In the simplest terms, commercial imagery, as we've talked about, is foundational to everything that's happening from a national security and civil protection, type of work. And if that imagery is cut, there will be an impact. And that, to me, that's really the message. There will be an impact if this is cut, and it will be felt.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. The firestorm continues over whether Iran's nuclear program was truly obliterated in Operation Midnight Hammer. For those just catching up, on Saturday, June 21st, President Donald Trump ordered strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities, Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordo. It's been reported that an Ohio-class submarine fired roughly 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles hitting targets in Isfahan, and then 7 B-2 bombers dropped 14 bunker busters on Natanz and Fordo. The latter is buried roughly 80 meters underground. That's about 23 stories down. The specialized munitions can burrow down to about 60 meters before detonating. The controversy, well, the White House's description of the damage from these strikes doesn't exactly match initial battle damage assessments. Plus, Maxar intelligence satellites apparently captured nuclear materials being moved from the targets days before the B-2s arrived. What we haven't heard about are the space systems that made Midnight Hammer possible and that support the protection of U.S. forces in the Middle East every day. And some of those space systems are commercially owned. Up top, Hector Falcon from the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center and Clint Clark from ExoAnalytic explained the space piece in the planning and execution of Operation Midnight Hammer. Then Susanne Hake from Maxar Intelligence is joining me to discuss how the administration's 2026 budget request could cause U.S. military to lose access to critical, commercially derived Earth observation intelligence that defense analysts, planners, and operators depend on for missions just like this. But first, here's my conversation with Hector and Clint. Hey there, Hector. Clint, thank you both so much for making the time to come on the Downlink podcast.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you very much.
Now, Hector, you've been on before, but we have new listeners all the time. Could you take a moment and introduce yourself, what the Space-ISAC is, and what you do there?
Absolutely can, Laura. So I'm Hector Falcon, Space-ISAC Watch Center Director. My role here is to go ahead and take a look at strategic elements with regards to cyber, space, and intelligence, and how an adversary could potentially leverage those. Here at the Space-ISAC, we conduct information sharing across a broader public space community in order to get after collective defense by sharing of particular tactics and techniques through the adversarial chain in order to inform each other and provide a greater awareness to the greater space community.
Thank you. And Clint, same for you. But this is your first time, so it'd be great if you could introduce yourself to the audience and also what ExoAnalytic does and what you do there.
Sure. Thanks, Laura. My name's Clint Clark. I'm the Vice President of First Impressions at ExoAnalytic Solutions. Probably never heard of one of those before, but simply put, my job is to tell people who we are, what we stand for. Mostly, we're known for doing space domain awareness, which is tracking and keeping up with satellites. We tend to focus mostly on higher orbits, things like medium Earth orbit, geosynchronous Earth orbit, or MEO or GEO. And that's where all the really interesting satellites are for us. And that's what we'll talk about today. Glad this is an audio recording. I just had surgery on my eye. And so today, unlike normally, I got a face made for radio. So I'm glad we're doing this audio only today, Laura.
Oh, you are welcome on my air anytime. So this has been a few quite eventful days for the US and for space systems. This is a space business and space defense podcast. So let's pick apart from just what we can glean from the open source the role space systems have likely played before, during, and after the US bombing of nuclear sites in Iran. From reporting and press conferences, we know that the days before the B 2 bombers took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, that the United States provided Israel with a list of Iranian air defense systems it wanted eliminated ahead of time to shape the battle space before launching Operation Midnight Hammer. We also know that on Saturday, June 21st, a U.S. Navy submarine launched more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles that hit the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center. After the Tomahawk missiles, F-35 fighter jets escorted the group of 7 B-2 bombers to the Fordo Uranium Enrichment Plant and the Natanz nuclear facility. Now, once they arrived, they dropped 14 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, which are also called MOPs or MOPs. We also like to call them bunker busters, but that doesn't really do justice in describing their power of, this particular ordnance. A GBU-57 weighs 14,000 kilograms. It burrows more than 60 meters through concrete or mountain before detonating. And GBU actually stands for Guided Bomb Unit, not Great Bodily Ultra Harm or something like that, though I imagine that would be part of it. But that Guided Bomb Unit part is where space comes in. These bombs are guided by GPS signals and an internal navigation system. So, gentlemen, with that background as just a start, what roles, starting from planning, did space systems likely play in Operation Midnight Hammer? Let's start with someone who knows a wee bit about planning and who has worked in planning shops with the Air Force. What say you, Clint?
Well, thanks, Laura. I think I'll take it back even further than what you described. When you think about the role space systems play, they affect all levers of government power. So we always talk about what are levers of power, the dime, the diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And so long before this conflict, space systems have been supporting all those elements of power. What you described were sort of the particulars of this event. Learning about those events would have been ongoing for weeks, months, years, in some cases. And space would have played a critical role. There would have been other intelligence activities happening, trying to understand where the sites are, what they have inside, what their vulnerabilities are, what their strengths are. But space would have played an important role in maintaining that information over time, identifying changes, et cetera. And then when you get into the operation, you talked about GPUs. They could have been guided by GPS. And if they were, of course, that was done by space systems, could have also been guided by laser, which could have been a person on the ground pointing laser, could have been the aircraft itself pointing the laser. So a lot of different options there. But if it were GPS guided, of course, that is a space-based component. So I'd say with regard to this operation, space has been involved for, maybe these plans haven't been in the work for years, but certainly the understanding that led to the creation of these plans has been in the work for years.
And Hector, what say you?
I definitely concur with that assessment. And I'll even think about the other pieces as well. At times we forget about the other 3 letters that are attached to the dime, the diplomatic, information, military, and economic, but also financial, intelligence, and law enforcement. When we think about what happened as a precursor, we actually understand that, well, there were actual nation states that has actually even opened up to some of these post attacks and offered capabilities, but also offered elements of misinformation through different types of cyber attacks as well. And we think of cyber as being a ground level thing here on the planet Earth, but in reality, quite a bit of that was fostered through that connectivity, but also as a result of the understanding that space brings with the forethought, with the planning, but also with the distinction, the tracking, the response, and then follow-on engagement, such as what we've seen here recently, different adversaries starting to uptick their level of actual adversarial attacks as well.
And wouldn't space systems also play a pretty large role in battle damage assessment? I mean, that's been in the news as well. I mean, the DIA allegedly has said that, well, maybe we didn't do or go down as far as we could have. I'm not really sure. And I'm not really, I really don't want to take away from the pilots who flew these missions or actually the munitions, because I think people don't understand this is really, really hard stuff, right? This is very pinpoint stuff. But that battle damage assessment also gives us a lot of knowledge of how well those munitions work, how well the mission works, how what to do in the next time. So, how important are space systems to just understanding what happened?
So I'll take the first shot at that, Laura. So first, in full disclosure, my job is typically to look up from the ground toward satellites, not down from satellites toward the ground. But I think everybody saw on the news videos and pictures, still images that were from commercial sources of the sites with 3 holes in the ground saying, here are the impact points, whether that's true or not. I mean, you've seen it on open source. Let's assume that they're correct. One, they show the pinpoint precision nature of the impacts, assuming the targets were hit exactly where they were expected to be hit, where they wanted to be hit. What you can't see from those images is what happens underground. I think that's the important part. And so that'd be a limitation you couldn't do from say, an imagery satellite, right? So you see the picture, you see what's in it. You have to infer what's happening in the things that you can't see. And so it takes other elements to figure those parts out. What's interesting, of course, is we're focusing on the U.S. attack and the U.S. side of this and what they've done. Space works both ways, right? So now the world knows that we did this operation, we executed them. So whatever other adversaries' space systems were doing, they now have ground truth that we did fire a certain number of Tomahawks, we did fly a certain number of aircraft, we did drop a certain number of bombs. I'm sure they're going back through their information that was collected by their space systems to see if they have unambiguous information that says, oh, we actually were able to detect that, or we weren't able to detect that. And they're doing their own follow-up assessments of the engagement and trying to determine what their space systems could have observed and learned throughout the engagement as well, not just the U.S. side, but I think it's happening all the way around. Both all the interested parties and all of the extra parties that have space capabilities are doing that today.
That's a really, really important point, Clint. Thank you so much for breaking that up. But what roles are space systems playing now, right, during what is supposed to be a ceasefire?
That's a very good point. I see that actually, Laura, as a very interesting element. When we think about detection, early warning, the counter to the counter, and earlier I mentioned response and engagement, having to kind of identify some of those elements with regards to the ceasefire, and has a line been crossed? Are there physical vehicles moving across a border? Are there actual spectrum radio frequency jamming events that are starting as a precursor? I could see space being intricately involved in monitoring for anything above background noise, or in this case, status quo operations being something of value to say, okay, this doesn't look the same. All of a sudden there's an uptick in movement. Wait a second, that could be adversarial. Let's take a peek. So tipping and queuing would be important here as well.
And what kind of role did space systems do you think played in Iran's missile attack on Oladid Air Base in Qatar? Would space systems be able to give early warning for something like that? Because it's not like a really long distance.
Yeah, for sure. If you think about, we use Israel's Iron Dome system, right? So there's layers to what it's doing, right? So the first thing that happens are you're trying to detect and see if you see fireballs taking off, right? Those fireballs that are detected are the first thing. And then you see if you can detect moving pieces of metal. And then you see if you can track the moving pieces of metal, right? Space systems have a role in fireball detection, moving metal detection, all the way through. At some point, you're relying on terrestrial systems to radar track what's going on, but typically first warnings are done by space systems. Back to your point on the ceasefire components, just thinking through the pieces there, like monitoring a ceasefire seems pretty straightforward, right? Is metal from one place landing in another place? That seems like the easiest metric of success is a ceasefire happening. But what Hector was talking about, I think, is super interesting, right? it's not just the fact that you're moving metal. Are you starting to position and reposition forces? Are you starting to do some of the elements required to make a subsequent strike successful? I think Hector talked about cyber attacks potentially. Are you starting to affect the electromagnetic spectrum? Are you doing concealment behaviors? Like, there's a whole host of things that you would do leading up to an attack, even during a ceasefire. I don't know that any of that is or isn't happening, but what the situation a few days ago when Israel purported to have air superiority, right, with aircraft in the air at all times, basically nothing moving on the ground is safe in that situation. Today, that's not the case. I would expect to see lots of movement of equipment and personnel on the ground today that are safe. If you can't monitor that from aircraft, then you need to monitor that from space. And then someone's got to be making an evaluation. Are these movements preparatory for subsequent strikes? Are these movements just to recover from what was happening? Are they going back to garrison? Are they, like, you want to go through those sequences and look at what's happening. And space will play a critical role in figuring out if those things are happening versus, which direction are pieces of equipment moving, and what does that infer about the likelihood of a ceasefire maintaining?
So now that we have a clear understanding of the value of space systems in Operation Midnight Hammer and the ceasefire, you cannot tell me that the adversaries, right? You both have mentioned them, that Russia and China specifically have not noticed that value that space systems has played in this operation. And if I'm not mistaken, there have been some interesting developments on orbit. I know from what you have shown me recently, Hector, that there are some interesting developments in electronic warfare and also some cyber. So what's the current state of play in the space domain? And don't forget that the ground is also involved in this. Who wants to kick this part off?
Hector, why don't you go first?
I'll definitely. When we think about what's happening on orbit, and you're right, the state of play is the similar thought process as the adversary always has a say, right? So when we think about it, for instance, TJS-3 as an actual satellite on orbit has been maneuvering in particular ways that kind of give an element of capture that is outside of its typical pattern of life. And that's something that we've been able to see thanks to the greater collaborative community. What's interesting is that we're starting to see a greater array of satellites that are actually maneuvering in areas where they normally wouldn't, even though their mission and their payload, their purpose is for GPS or for sensing. Now these satellites are posturing and maneuver, similar to Clinton's point there. They're posturing and maneuvering potentially to get a better angle, but also to support either an offensive or counter type movement in order to understand what's happening on a terrestrial plane. We're also starting to see different envelopes of investments. So when we think about finances, we think of an index portfolio like stocks and bonds, but from an adversarial standpoint, investments are also what's being launched as well, and where, in order to take advantage of not only placement, but some of the elements that Clint mentioned earlier, that concealment, but also the operational footprint. While the cat's away, the mice will play. That also comes to play between the ground and space. Clint?
Yeah, I think I agree with what you say, Hector. From my perspective, we look up, right? So if you think about the space systems, there's a ground segment, there's a link segment, there's a space segment. And we typically watch the space segment. So we can see the behaviors of satellites on orbit. And then we try to assess what we're seeing. We try to make sense of their behavior. Do they look like they're behaving normally, like a communication satellite? Are they doing something else, right? So we tend to focus on geosynchronous Earth orbit. That's where most communication satellites are. And you go to that orbit because it's a special place, right? You can sit in one location and broadcast over about half of the Earth. So think about, to the audience, think about every time you've seen a satellite dish at someone's house. It's just mounted to their house, pointed south if you live in the northern hemisphere, at one spot, and it's fixed because the satellite it's pointing at relative to your house is in a fixed position. And so when you see satellites in geo not behaving that way, you have to try to infer what is the reason they went to this very specific, very expensive orbit location, and then don't use the benefits of that orbit. And so Hector mentioned the satellite. I would say, with regard to the broader context of your question, Laura, since Desert Storm in 1991, every nation on Earth was put on notice how important space is to effective combat practice, and certainly to the way that the U.S. likes to fight, with speed and precision, minimal collateral damage, etc. And so for many, many years, the world has known that, and our adversary nations, our peer nations, have been working on capabilities to counter that advantage. I would say in the last decade, to Hector's point, we've observed a ton of very specific counter space type activities by both Russia and China, designed to either protect their space capabilities from us or to take away our space capabilities to try to limit our combat power. And that has been going on for at least the last 10 years. As long as we've been in business, we've been observing it. And I think it's been ramping up over the last few years.
Has there been any sort of movement associated with what's been going on in the Middle East, though? Or are they just sort of sitting pat and watching?
One nice thing about geo is you can, once you're up there, you get to see a lot of the Earth, right? The Middle East is in a pretty sweet spot, halfway between, Asia and Europe. And so that, a lot of satellites are already there operating. Clint's opinion, I didn't see anything that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up with any satellites operating in and around the Middle East before or during what we're seeing in Iran and Israel. Doesn't mean anything didn't happen. Again, we only see the motion of the spacecraft. I don't see what their payloads are doing. I'm not watching the electromagnetic spectrum or anything like that. But nothing that I saw was any more or less shocking than other things we've been watching for the last 10 or 15 years. And didn't seem to be anything particular that was Iran or Israel focused.
And Hector, from the Space-ISAC's view, I mean, you guys track cyber, and I know that you really look at the electromagnetic spectrum. I mean, have there been any upticks or even downticks or anything out of the ordinary over this past weekend during this operation?
Believe it or not, what we've seen is just a steady state level of kind of signals interference. Several different airports did kind of denote several different GPS interference elements. We saw some UK, United Kingdom type inputs and alerts on the nautical domain. There were also some kind of automated information system digest that we were able to see from aircraft transponders that kind of gave us a little bit of tipping and cueing as to what was seen. Now, what we have seen are also some leveraging of telecommunications impacts. For instance, Iran purposefully went ahead and turned down their internet connectivity for the purpose of trying to make their threat landscape aperture a little bit smaller, that gateway into their cyber kind of division. So they did kind of start turning that down on purpose in order to kind of close that door for
batten down the hatches.
Absolutely. So even though there were some attacks that were promulgated in that window, quite a bit of what was returning back kind of died off and didn't actually get through on purpose. So that was a very effective method of countering the counter, understanding that with every attack, you should expect a counterattack, to Clint's point earlier.
Pure curiosity for me. So I would have definitely expected to see GPS jamming ramp up. Hector, did you notice anything like GLONASS jamming or BIDOW jamming, anything like that in your feedback networks that we were seeing jamming across the board on GNS or global navigation services?
Believe it or not, what some of our kind of requests for information over the past couple of days we've received are predominantly on GPS and Galileo. We didn't see too many bits of feedback on GLONASS or BeiDou type impacts out there. What we did see were more maneuvers by some of these satellites that were purportedly putting out GPS signaling with regards to BeiDou and GLONASS, but we did not see any distinct impacts on those two particular elements. Over.
Would that mean anything? I mean, I hate to make you analyze on the spot, but yeah, what does that mean?
It definitely could. It definitely could mean some elements too. When we think about what has the preponderance of connectivity within that region and what has the overlay, similar to your iPhone now, you can see 3, 4 different GPS constellations on a regular iPhone, even if you are within the United States, you could still see Beta, you could still see some GLONASS coverage as well. So seeing that there's been suppression of a particular Russian base GPS interface, that would be interesting of note with regards to already thinking ahead to saying, okay, well, maybe what's incoming to my area of operation has a Russian type signature. So maybe let me suppress that. What do you think, Clint?
Well, I always see GPS jamming plots on, when I'm going through X and trying to understand what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, for example. There are several open source folks that'll show the degraded GPS over different regions. I just hadn't seen anything like that in over the Middle East. My open source sources hadn't created anything, so it was pure curiosity, and I was just also curious. Did they, I think there was this concern that there was going to be expanded players in the game once the U.S. got involved. I'd be curious. Did that then lead to subsequently expansion of how people were dealing with the electromagnetic spectrum? But that was just a pure curiosity question because you have answers that I don't.
I think it's really interesting that there haven't been a lot of changes. Maybe everybody's kind of in watch and analyze mode, right? I mean, they're taking notes for sure. I mean, I would, right? So as we all know, right, inside the space bubble that we are in, U.S. military relies a lot on commercial systems for communications, for remote sensing, Earth observation, and space situational awareness. So it's also the nature of dual use capabilities. So what I'd really like to have from you guys to close this out is, what should space systems operators think about in this time? Both those operators that have assets on orbit and those who operate assets that are part of the ground segment. Clint, why don't you go first? Look up.
I was hoping Hector would go first, but okay, so I'll let me take a crack at it. I think businesses that support the military, they know that they do, and so the first thing you think of, like, as an entrepreneur is, can we make something that's useful and can we sell it? I mean, that's how you start. But then once you get on contract, your customers hold you to account for certain levels of service, and so then you've got to build in your robustness to meeting various levels of service. And in some cases, that means cyber protection, it means redundant sites, it means physical security, it means all those things. We monitor performance continuously, and we make sure we're doing that. But the protection piece, I think what you're implying there is, like, should we do something different? We had to look at how you make a robust system before we made the first nickel of money. And so it's robust now, and the processes we put in place are designed to hold when there's more pressure on the systems, right? It's designed to allow us to flex and do those types of things. And I assume for other types of businesses, for satellite operators, for launchers, for terminal providers, they already are thinking about the protection of their investment, right? They're going to have a COO and a CFO, and they're going to be accountable for making sure they stay operating efficiently and they stay afloat financially. And so they should have tons of process in place to make sure that their systems are going to operate in the face of whatever happens to them. And so for us, there's no change. Be curious what Hector sees from his perspective.
Yeah, Hector, have any advice for the commercial sector at this time?
I do, and I appreciate that input there, Clint, and the question as well, Laura. So I started off by thinking of awareness of sharing, awareness of where am I flying over, if you're that owner operator, awareness of my payloads and patches if I'm at the ground station, or if you're an updated satellite, right, with the capability to do software updates on the fly. There have been several different investments over the past year to get after that. Instead of waiting to go ahead and push a revision, can you go ahead and do that and go ahead and close off some of those actual entrance points? Also, identification of who is actually challenging your communication path, but also the business mechanism as well. Here in the past 6 months, we've seen involvement by adversaries in the business sense in order to get after obfuscating the intent, but also living off the land purposes, involvements from a terrestrial ground kind of cyber perspective. But what does that do? Sometimes I don't have to necessarily attack the satellite. If I can go ahead and cut off the financial mechanism that buys the airtime, I have already achieved my goal without ever moving anything out of a parked orbit, on orbit, or maneuvering in a kinetic sense. So definitely challenging, identifying baselines, and being able to share readily what is being seen, those indicators, those components, and then also what's challenging you from a threat perspective as well. The greater community is all full of sensors. Let's go ahead and definitely help each other out with regards to collective defense.
Thank you so much for that, Hector. And Hector, Clint, thank you both so much for making the time to come on the podcast.
Thank
Laura,
you.
you're welcome. Hopefully it'll be fun for your listeners.
Thank you for having us.
Now, at the same time, Susanne Hake of Maxar Intelligence and I got together for this interview. That was Thursday morning. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Caine, along with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, were in a press conference. They were highlighting the work of many who were involved in Operation Midnight Hammer. But they forgot the space piece of this operational equation. I've scanned the transcript. No mention of Space Force, Space Command, or the commercial companies and employees who protect the space systems that made this operation possible, like secure satellite communications, the ground segment, and those Earth observation products the DoD has been using for 15 plus years to understand these targets in Iran and to develop the GBU-57 and plan Midnight Hammer. The DoD might want to start speaking up about this. The Earth observation space companies certainly are. 5 days before the strikes, June 16th, Maxar, Black Sky, Planet Labs, Capella Space, ISAC, and KSAT warned legislators in a letter that, quote, the FY26 budget request for the National Reconnaissance Office entirely removes funding for a commercial synthetic aperture radar program, makes significant reductions to the electro-optical commercial program, and disregards funding for future commercial radio frequency acquisitions at scale, unquote. So I asked Susanne, what's really at risk? Here's our conversation. Hello, Susanne. It's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much for having me today.
So this is your first time on the downlink, not the first for Maxar, but it would be great if you could take a moment and introduce yourself. Susanne?
Yeah, I'm Susanne Hake. I'm the Senior Vice President and General Manager for the U.S. government business at Maxar. Prior to Maxar, I spent about a decade at Palantir Technologies and previously worked at the National Security Council.
Also, I think it would be super useful if you could very briefly explain the delineation between Maxar Space Systems and Maxar Intelligence. I mean, we always refer to it as Maxar, but they are two different things, no?
You are right. About 2 years ago, Maxar split into two companies, and Maxar Intelligence, which is where I work, and Maxar Space Systems. Maxar Space Systems is a primarily hardware manufacturing company. Maxar Intelligence, we design and own and operate our satellites, collect the imagery, and we turn the imagery into all of the different mapping products and software capabilities. So there is a tie between the companies, but they are two distinct entities now.
Thank you so much for that. So since Saturday, how busy have you been?
Very busy. It's always busy, but very busy considering, how the recent events have continued to highlight the importance of commercial imagery in terms of national security.
And it's not just media outlets, though, right? I mean, you have a whole bunch of customers.
Yeah, so commercial imagery supports the entire intelligence community, the Department of Defense, and actually a lot of different civil and state and local use cases as well.
And Maxar has been providing Earth observation imagery to the U.S. government. It was called a different name then, but it was since 1993 that first contract was with the Department of Commerce, I believe. And then starting in the noughts, contracts with the National Geospatial Agency. In the teens, Maxar expanded its government customer base to include others in the government intelligence community. And generally speaking, in this unclassified format, what does Maxar provide to this customer set, right? And I'm talking about the government customer set because that really is what's in the news. And every night when we turn on the television, right? If you turn on CNN, you see, satellite imagery and you see Maxar's logo right there. So what's going to the government side of this equation, though?
Maxar is the largest provider of high-resolution electro-optical imagery, electro-optical commercial imagery. And we provide 90% actually of the US government's foundation imagery and foundation mapping capabilities. Let me explain what foundation means.
Please.
It's called foundation because it's foundational. So commercial imagery feeds so many different capabilities across the US government and defense and intelligence missions. For example, commercial imagery is part of various maps for safety of navigation. For military use cases, it feeds into operations and mission planning products. It's also used for, NASA environmental monitoring, NOAA's creation of aeronautical charts, FEMA disaster response. For example, last year during Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, Maxar collected over 200,000 square kilometers of imagery over Florida and North Carolina to support FEMA's disaster response efforts. So commercial imagery is used in all of these different use cases. You see in the news often, this weekend, some of those more national security use cases, but we also see a lot of the humanitarian and disaster response use cases as well.
So 5 days before the U.S. sent B-2 bombers to target Iran's nuclear facilities in a joint operation with Israel, on June 16th, Maxar and 5 other Earth observation companies sent a letter to Congress. What's in that letter? What's at stake?
So right now, there are concerns that there are going to be budget cuts to the commercial imagery line. And so that is, what we are concerned about, considering the wide variety of use cases for commercial imagery. We're hearing there could be up to a 30% cut in funding for commercial imagery.
And where are these cuts being proposed?
So, we're in the middle of the congressional budget cycle, as you know. So there's a lot of different players who are putting forward potential cuts. And right now, what we're focused on is an education campaign and, doing things like this podcast. I was on Capitol Hill yesterday and really explaining what commercial imagery is and what, more importantly, are going to be the impacts if commercial imagery is cut by these potentially up to 30% cuts. There will be an impact, and I think it will be felt across the entire community.
Well, aren't there I believe three specific programs that were mentioned in the letter and also what's being reported on that it happens to be with the intelligence community. There's the Commercial Synthetic Aperture Radar or COMSAR program. There's the Electro-Optical Commercial Layer or EOCL program. And then there's Commercial Radio Frequency or RF acquisitions at scale, which I believe is also a particular kind of program. If those things, or specifically the Commercial Synthetic Aperture Radar, COMSAR program, my understanding is that it would be completely cut, like totally, as in, just cut out. If just the COMSAR program was cut out, do you have any idea how that would impact planning or battle damage assessments, or how about the warfighter downrange or in a cockpit?
So, COMSAR and RF, in addition to electro-optical imagery, which Maxar provides, altogether, they're critical to providing a picture of what might be going on the ground or in a particular area, because they all provide different types of capability. ComSAR and radar can be particularly helpful when it's cloudy or at night or in different types of weather, whereas electro-optical is very high resolution. You can really see what's on the ground, but if there's clouds, that can be a challenge. So together, all of those types of imagery all play into really providing a complete picture. So,
and that helps in decision making and
Exactly.
choosing your targets and, what's in the way and, well, where perhaps those anti-aircraft emplacements were in Iran that we shared with Israel, I would suppose. But that's what you're talking about, correct?
Correct. So, together, all of those pieces of information can tip and cue each other, can play different roles in providing that situational awareness and doing different types of site monitoring and analytics. And so together we kind of call all of those the commercial data providers. So there's different types of data, but all not classified commercial imagery.
So have you heard any reasoning from anybody in Congress as to why these cuts are proposed? Or is this just sort of like, that's good, we'll take that off? I mean, seriously, has there been a justification?
You're going to have to ask them to justify and explain what's going on.
Good pushback. I salute you. All right. Well, have you heard from any members since you submitted this letter? You can answer that one.
What we're hearing and what I believe might be going on is honestly that there's new people and new players that are making decisions, right? There's a lot of stakeholders that have a role to play in commercial imagery funding. And so we believe that, there's some new players that still need to be educated on what commercial imagery is and what the impact will be.
If you could put it into one sentence, because we are wrapping this up, for those new folks that don't really get it, what do they need to understand so that we can ensure that our men and women get the imagery that they need to carry out these very important operations on behalf of our nation?
In the simplest terms, commercial imagery, as we've talked about, is foundational to everything that's happening from a national security and civil protection type of work. And if that imagery is cut, there will be an impact. And that, to me, that's really the message. There will be an impact if this is cut, and it will be felt.
And it could save lives if you had it.
Right. From a national security or a disaster relief perspective, right? It's not just national security and kind of intelligence and operations, but really those FEMA, NOAA, NASA use cases as well.
Wildfire fighting, all that sort of stuff.
Hurricanes, things like that. So it's almost hurricane season, right? So.
Yep, there you go. Susanne, thank you so much for making the time to come on the podcast and bring this issue to the attention of this audience.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.